During its period of partition in the 19th century, Poland has acquired quite a repertoire of uprisings. However, none of those come even close in terms of scale and consequences to the failed uprising of 1830 against the Russian Empire, especially when you consider the very unique status Poland enjoyed within the Tsardom. Let's take a closer look at what led to this full-blown war and what its end meant for Poland and its neighbouring countries. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814, a very important question was raised, namely that of the future of the Polish state. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Castlereagh, suggested 3 different options, of which 2 included an independent Poland. However, both Prussia and Russia had already reached a mutual agreement by which Russia could keep all the territories from the former Duchy of Warsaw if Prussia was allowed to annex Saxony. The question remained unsolved and tensions between the great powers rose to a boiling point. As soon as news of Napoleon returning to France made their way to Vienna, however, a new compromise was met. Prussia could keep the provinces of Posen and Danzig, Austria gained Tarnopol, and Russia essentially got the rest. With that, Poland was once again partitioned by foreign powers. The situation in Russia was a bit special, largely due to the efforts of Adam Jerzy Czartoryski, the former foreign minister of Russia and a close friend of Tsar Alexander I. The Polish monarchy was restored under a personal union with the Russian Empire, with a very high degree of autonomy. The kingdom was a lot smaller than the last independent Polish state, which earned its commonly used Polish diminutive, Kongresówka. In English, the poor little creation of the Congress. Still, the situation was not too terrible. There was still hope that a benevolent Russia might one day unite the now incorporated gubernias with the rest of the kingdom. The Polish population was growing quickly, and Warsaw became a highly important cultural centre. The constitution, which also came into existence thanks to Czartoryski, was one of, if not the most liberal, in all of Europe. Poland got its own passports and citizenship. It had its own government, its own judicial system, and its own assembly, the Sejm. Polish was the language used in administration, and only Polish citizens were allowed to hold public offices. Poland had its own quite sizable army. Catholicism was the state religion, but all other flavours of Christianity were at least tolerated. The constitution guaranteed freedom of the press, personal and religious freedom, equality before the law, and freedom from arbitrary punishment. The fact that this set of principles was even accepted by the conservative Holy Alliance is nothing short of amazing. However, what was promised in theory was not always followed up on in practice. At the time, there was a sarcastic saying that went something along the lines of, "Under the Duchy of Warsaw, we had no guarantees of civil liberties, and nobody noticed it. The Kingdom of Poland does guarantee civil liberties, but nobody notices that either." On top of that, it was mostly property owners that ruled the country, who usually simply ignored the wishes of the peasant population, and the judges often sided with landlords when it came to disputes with the lower classes. The Tsar also exercised significant power. He appointed the Viceroy and the Commander-in-Chief, and had the power to simply dissolve the Sejm. On top of that, he also controlled the Polish foreign policy and the civilian police through the Ministry of the Interior in St. Petersburg. Tsar Alexander I was rather surprisingly quite fascinated with the liberal Polish state. He visited Warsaw almost every year and constantly promised to guarantee the status quo. He appointed his brother, Grand Duke Konstantin Pawlowicz, as the commander-in-chief of the Polish army. Konstantin would later marry a Polish duchess called Joanna Grodzińska and renounce his claim on the Russian throne. As you can imagine, not everybody in Poland approved of the constitution, and for the entire duration of its existence, conservative and liberal minds often argued about how the kingdom should be run. One example. The director of the Commission of Education and Religious Cult, Stanisław Kostka-Potocki, made sure that there were vast advances in the Polish educational sector. He made sure that the University of Warsaw got 5 new faculties. A mining school was opened in Kielce, an agronomic institute was founded in Marymont, and most importantly, more than 1,000 public primary schools were in operation by 1821. This development angered a lot of people, especially conservative reactionaries supported by the Catholic Church, who did not approve of this rapid rise of secular education. Because of this, Potocki became the victim of a Catholic smear campaign. He was forced to give up his position as director when he published a satirical essay called Podróż do Ciemnogrodu, or Journey to Ignorance Town. He was succeeded by the reactionary Stanisław Grabowski, who kindly closed 2/3 of public schools. Anyway, how was Poland's economy doing? Short answer, not great, and by 1820 the country registered a very high deficit, and the Tsar threatened to annex the country if the situation went on like that. Its economy was mostly based on agriculture, and the private landowners still relied on what was practically serf labour and outdated farming methods. Unsurprisingly, this did not increase food output, and only 34% of all the lands were actively ploughed. The state had to constantly make sure that those estates did not go bankrupt. Peasants without land were often evicted, and those who could stay suffered from brutal direct or indirect taxes, which made sure that they could not become a part of the consumer market. Still, the country with its vast coal, zinc and copper reserves had huge potential, and the new Minister of the Treasury, Franciszek Drucki-Lubecki, wanted to exploit that and transform Poland into a modern economy. Poland became a part of Russia's customs area, and shortly after exports there increased threefold. Drucki-Lubecki founded the Bank of Poland in 1828 to finance his ambitions. He heavily invested into the old Polish basin, which was very, very rich in coal. Dozens of furnaces were built, workers' houses and roads were constructed, and until the 1830s he managed to double the output of hard coal mining. During the 1820s, the small village of Łódź grew to over 8,000 inhabitants and became an important centre of the wool and textile industry. The city attracted thousands of industrialists and cloth makers from Germany, and soon Łódź gained its nickname Manchester of the East. Warsaw also grew rapidly and became an important producer of luxury items and metals. The agricultural sector was also somewhat fixed by the creation of the Land Credit Society. This allowed the landowners to free themselves from their crushing debts. The increasing popularity of the potato made it possible for peasants to survive off smaller lands, and it created the very profitable vodka industry, of which the state soon held a monopoly over. These developments are remarkable, but they were achieved at a cost. The peasant class was hit with devastating taxes and higher prices on daily goods such as salt and tobacco. In 1825, Tsar Nicholas I took over the Russian throne, and his personality was different from his predecessor. He was a proud autocrat who made no secret about the fact that he despised the liberal Polish constitution. He had been deeply shocked by the Decembrist revolt in December of the same year, where some 3,000 members of the Russian army attempted a coup against the newly crowned Tsar. The uprising had connections to the Kingdom of Poland, and Nicholas wanted to make sure that they were brought to justice. Some members of the Polish Patriotic Society were brought before the Senate, but the tribunal argued that no treason against Russia had been committed, and only sentenced the accused to minor punishments. Constantine, the commander-in-chief, was furious and forbade the publication of the verdict. The Tsar intervened, and in the end the alleged Decembrists were punished by the Tsar himself. Many young Polish nationalists became radicalized by this event, and saw it as proof that secret societies were banned under Russian rule. By 1829, much of Poland found itself in opposition to the Russian Tsar. The oppositions had different flavors and interpretations, but all wanted the constitution to remain intact. Russia had violated that constitution almost from the very beginning. It followed a policy of censorship, curtailed sessions of the Sejm, and increased the number of secret policemen in the country. Most of the opposition and most dreams of secession came from the lower officer ranks. In the cadet officers' school in Warsaw, a conspiracy against the Tsar began to be hatched by the lieutenants Piotr Wysocki and Józef Zalewski. Together with other conspiratorial civilian groups, they plotted the assassination of Grand Duke Constantine. 1830 was a very turbulent year in Europe. Greece was recognized as an independent state by the London Protocol. In Paris, the last Bourbon king was finally overthrown during the July Revolution, and in Belgium an independent Belgian state was proclaimed. The revolutionary sentiments were probably one factor that inspired the conspirators to follow up on their plan. You see, there were rumours flying around that the Tsar might use the Polish army to crush the rebellions in France and Belgium. To many, that rumour got confirmed when on the 19th of November, the newspapers announced the first notices of general mobilization. Grand Duke Constantine had actively opposed the use of Polish troops against foreign uprisings, and those announcements gave the impression that he gave in to the Tsar's will. Many recognized that if the Polish army were to be mobilized and if Russian troops were to enter Poland, all hopes for a successful revolution would be gone. So during a quiet winter night on the 29th of November, a group of 24 civilian conspirators snuck into the Belvedere Palace in Warsaw with one goal: kill Constantine. However, they certainly were no masters of planning, and from the very beginning everything that could go wrong went wrong. The signal fire at an abandoned brewery went off way too early and alerted the garrison. Their emergence into the palace was also unnecessarily tumultuous, which allowed Constantine to escape the city unharmed. In the subsequent chaos, the conspirators were joined by angry rebels and took control over the city, but the Russian garrisons were left untouched. Constantine refused to order his army to attack and claimed that the Poles had to deal with this issue themselves. Trocki-Lubecki then seized the initiative and formed a sort of temporary government in the hopes of negotiating with the Tsar and of quenching the rebellion. Keep in mind that neither he nor the majority of the government ever wanted any revolution like this and were now tasked with the very difficult challenge of handling it. General Józef Łapicki proclaimed himself dictator with Trocki-Lubecki's blessings. He didn't prepare for a full-on war against Russia and instead hoped that diplomacy might win. However, the Tsar was not in the mood for negotiations and told Constantine that either Poland or Russia would have to perish. It is not exactly clear whether he had already set his mind on annexing Poland when he came to the throne, but he certainly used the November revolts as an excuse for a military operation. He ignored all Polish diplomats who travelled to St. Petersburg to speak with him and ordered General Davies to prepare for a war. When it became clear in Warsaw what he was trying to do, the Sejm legally dethroned Nicholas I. On the 5th of February, 1831, Russian troops crossed the border, and thus the revolt turned into a bloody war. I will not really go into the details of how the Russo-Polish War went down, but here's the short story. Despite not being prepared enough, Polish troops put up quite some resistance against the Russian army, and at the Battle of Kocój managed to temporarily prevent the capture of Warsaw. The turning point came at the Battle of Ostrołęka in May, where the Russian army gained a major victory. In September, Warsaw capitulated, and the political leaders fled over the border to Prussia and Austria. They were not alone with their desire to leave, and soon after the end of the war, thousands of Poles, intellectuals, ministers, politicians, and generals emigrated to other European countries. The majority of them went to France, and especially Paris soon became an important centre of Polish culture. On their way west through Germany, they were met with an incredible amount of sympathy. In Dresden, they were seen as bringers of more constitutional liberties and were hailed as heroes. In Stuttgart, the Polish generals were given an honorary banquet where the Polish anthem was sung. The people of Würzburg sent a petition to the Bavarian king and begged him to publicly declare his support for an independent Poland. A wave of so-called Polenschwärmerei swept over Germany. The reasons for this phenomenon can be found in the post-Napoleonic order. In the Holy Alliance, liberal thoughts were often suppressed and censored, but that didn't stop their spread. Poland was seen by many liberals as the strongest counterexample against the conservative governments that surrounded it. Already during the war, Poland associations were founded all over Germany, which donated vast amounts of money and resources to Polish hospitals. Countless so-called Poland songs were written, praising the heroic fighting. The Prussian government itself was of course not very happy about this development, and openly opposed Polish independence as it also had a big Polish minority, but that's a story for another time. Friedrich Engels would later call the November Uprising and the war a conservative revolution led by the nobility. Was that true? To a certain extent, yes. The army was mostly made up of soldiers from a peasant background, and they certainly fought fiercely. Many peasants in the countryside openly supported the rebellion, be it out of fear from the Russians, hopes of financial gain, and sometimes even just patriotism. Many peasant communities began to raise funds for the war effort, signed oaths of loyalty, and spied on Russian troops. So the widespread theory that Polish peasants in the 1830s lacked any sense of what a nation and a Poland was falls flat. It is also wrong to claim that all layers of Polish society felt the same degree of patriotism. There were many riots against landlords during the war, desertions were a massive problem, and patriotic propaganda by aristocrats was often inefficient, with many peasants instead switching to the topic of compulsory labour. What can be said for sure is that the peasants felt cheated and betrayed. Maurycy Mochnacki, a very popular publicist, wrote in February of 1831, "Why do the masses not rise up? Because we are ignoring their problems." A motion introduced in March of the same year hoped to improve the situation of the lower classes by enabling them to pay rent to their landlords instead of working for them for free. This idea was quickly denied by the Sejm and just never brought up again. So what actually happened to this autonomous Poland after the war? About 80,000 people who were suspected of having supported the uprising were deported to distant Siberia. A further 250 were sentenced to death. The Russian army kept occupying Poland for quite a while and imposed brutally high taxes on those that remained. The army, the Sejm, and the universities were abolished, together with the liberal constitution. In 1833, Austrian, Russian and Prussian diplomats met up in München-Gries to make sure that any future uprising would be suppressed. Higher public offices were staffed with Russians and the złoty was replaced by the ruble. In 1837, the former autonomous voivodeships became Russian gubernias that were ruled directly by the Tsar. In the 1880s, even the name of Poland was replaced with the very ominous title of Vistula Land. It wouldn't be until 1980 that a Polish state with a similar degree of autonomy as that of Congress Poland finally emerged. Alright then, Dankeschön for watching the video, and I hope you've enjoyed it. If you did, a like and a subscribe are always appreciated. A very special and grateful thanks goes out to A Cup of Tea and Drix for their generous support over on Kocój. You are phenomenal. Have a very wonderful day, and see you next time.